What's up, everyone? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. In this episode, I'm going to be breaking down Chapter 3 of Matt Taibbi's book, The Divide, which I'm reading right here. It's been wonderful so far. It's kind of a long chapter, so it's been a couple of days coming. And what he talks about in this chapter is basically broken windows policing, which I'm going to break that down, what that actually means for you guys. And I'll do it as succinctly and yet comprehensively as I can. I'm going to break it down into two parts. The first part is going to be talking about a young black gentleman named Andrew Brown, who that's the first half of the chapter is about him. And he falls victim to the way that a lot of black people and poor people they get caught by the police, the way that they get wrangled into the judicial system and via arrests and summons. So I'm going to go through some of the specifics on what happened to Andrew and read to you from the book a little bit on what happened to him. And so the first part is going to be how the policing system catches poor people. The second part is going to be how they punish poor people versus how they punish rich people once they actually get you into the court system. And I'm going to read to you about a prostitute and her case that I think exemplifies exactly how that happens. And that happens, the punishment part of poor people once you get into the court system happens via cash bail, which I'll explain that to you. But it also, poor people are incentivized to take guilty charges via plea bargaining in a very nefarious way in our system. And that's the other thing, the plea bargaining system that basically forces poor people to take guilty pleas, even though a lot of times they've done nothing wrong, is completely backwards. And the way that the cash bail system is weaponized against poor people is also completely fucked up. So I'm going to go through that second. So let's talk about Andrew Brown and how the police catch poor people and broken windows policing. Broken windows policing is a term that came out of like the early 80s, I believe. I was watching an interview that Matt Taibbi had on Sam Cedar's show a couple of years ago, and he talked about this, and I also read up on some other things before I did this episode. Basically, in NYC, broken windows policing was a way, and I'll tell you what it means. Okay, broken windows policing came from the idea that if you see as a police officer a broken window in a neighborhood, that the only way to prevent further broken windows in the neighborhood was to stop and strip search everybody that you see on the street to make sure they don't have any stones in their pockets. So it gives justification for violating people's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure by stop and frisking them in always poor areas, because they only utilize this idea, broken windows policing, in poor areas, to basically stop and frisk all people of color, particularly males, before they've actually committed any crimes. And they can do this in a number of ways. They basically can make up, they say they smell weed in the air, so they stop and frisk you thinking that they might find weed on you. They come up with all these reasons to stop people that have nothing to do with anything other than they fit a description, which, as Taibbi puts it in the book, everybody in the hood fits the description, quote unquote. So it basically gives police the okay to violate people's Fourth Amendment rights under the same guise as like Minority Report, like pre-crime, like you're trying to prevent crime in the future, so it gives you the, probable cause to search these people against their Fourth Amendment rights, but it doesn't. Like it's a blatant violation of Fourth Amendment rights. So what they do is they will either give you the fit the description label, and they'll just stop you, and sometimes you end up with a knee in your back and handcuffs on your wrists if you even look at them the wrong way. But they also will arrest people or give people summons for bogus charges, like riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, or impeding pedestrian traffic, which is just being black and standing on a sidewalk. Disorderly conduct, loitering. A lot of these things are just bogus reasons for police to stop and search minorities for either weapons or drugs, or to run their name through the system to see if they have a warrant out for their arrest. Now that's how they catch you under the broken windows policing system, is they'll make up a reason to search you, and then they create a dragnet where they just basically blanket the entire poor area and harass these poor people of color by stopping and frisking them for no reason against their Fourth Amendment rights and seeing what sticks. And what they do is, if they can't get you on a minor drug charge, or if you don't have a weapon on you, or if you don't have a prior, and they've just thrown you face down on the sidewalk, is they'll give you a choice. They'll go, do you want to go down to the precinct, or do you want us just to let you go? And the reason that they do that is because they know that they've just roughed up somebody without probable cause who doesn't have any weapons or drugs on them and no priors, so you could actually go after them. Now, it would be exceedingly difficult for you to do so, but that's the reason that they'll, after they've found you clean a lot of times, will give you a choice of whether or not you actually want to go down to the precinct, because they know you don't want to get caught up in the system and you don't have the time a lot of times or the money to go in and fight any of these police brutality incidents. So they'll just give you a chance to go if they can't get anything to stick to you. But what they do is they just cast a wide net and see what sticks in the net. And that's how broken windows policing operates systematically when it comes to collecting people for the court system. Okay, so I'm going to read to you here from the book, actually, a very succinct little part about Andrew himself. Okay, so this is talking about Andrew Brown when he actually kind of cleaned up his act, got a job. He never really did anything bad in his past, but he did routinely get stopped by the cops all the time for stupid stuff like I just laid out. And now he's gotten his life together. He has a long-term girlfriend. He's trying to, work a job as a driver. I'm going to read to you this here. He started to go to classes to get his CDL, a commercial driver's license, with the idea that he would get a job driving a bus. Shanette, that's his new girlfriend, she was going to work for the housing authority. Everything was trending in the right direction except for one thing. He was out of the life, but the police never got the memo. If anything, he was getting stopped by police even more. The random nature of his situation started to sink in. In crime, out of crime, it didn't matter. What was constant was that the police had a buffet of options they could use to arrest any young man on the street in his neighborhood, and they used all those options, seemingly without regard to whether or not there was cause. Like, they could pick you up, arrest you at any time for disorderly conduct, which could mean just about anything. Their crime-fighting methods could best be described as accidental. They mostly just swept up every fish in the pond and threw back the ones they couldn't stick with a charge. The crazy thing was, anyone could be police, black, white, Hispanic, in uniform, out of uniform, marked cars or unmarked. That old cliche about cops you could spot a mile away with unmarked blue Plymouths didn't work in the 21st century Brooklyn, where the police could be driving anything, Lexuses, tricked-out SUVs, sports cars, beaters, the whole gamut. There was a special crime squad with a mandate to get guns by any means necessary that had a rep for driving really nice cars, and their officers were known for wearing sharp clothes. You could just be walking down the street and someone could grab you, which happened to Andrew more than once. It actually happened to him numerous times, and they go over that in detail for the first half of the chapter. So that's how they get you. Bogus charges like I've just laid out, and they'll either arrest you or give you a summons to show up in court. And they only do this stuff in basically largely minority and lower class neighborhoods, very poor neighborhoods. 9 out of 10, or at least 80% from everything I've seen, of these tactics result in black people getting, or Latino people getting arrested. It's almost never used against white people at all. So now I'm going to talk to you about what happens to you once you actually get into the court system, and how they use the very, very nefarious system of plea bargaining and cash bail to really rig the system against poor people. And then, of course, that means necessarily people of color. So the second part has to do with a court case that had to do with a prostitute who had a whole bunch of priors. Now, a lot of these priors were not even necessarily prostitution. They were, in fact, like loitering, which a lot of times that's what prostitutes get charged with. A cop pulls them over, finds out, or pulls them over, goes in and walks up to them on the street corner or whatever, and they're not actively engaging in prostitution, and they, search the hooker and they want to give her a summons for something. So a lot of times it ends up, if the cop can't nail them with anything, they just end up with a loitering summons, so they have to show up in court. So the pretext for that is this woman has 35 priors, and she's sitting in court kind of doped out right now, and Matt Taibbi's recollecting this, and it'll show you exactly what happens to these people once they get into the system. Yeah, there's no way she's getting off, the lawyer next to me whispers. She's got 35 priors. The woman's record is all misdemeanors, mostly for prostitution-type offenses, lots of loitering, but 35 priors nonetheless. Nobody with 35 priors gets a complete walk in this courtroom. I crane my neck to try to see what's going on, and all I can see is the defense, prosecution, and judge leaning towards one another, negotiating. Somebody mutters into a microphone. Her supervisor will accept time served and the violation. Then there's nodding all around, and suddenly, like a football team breaking a huddle, all parties retreat to their own stations. A gavel is rapped, and the defendant, nodding but yes, eye still closed, is led away. She's agreed to the violation. If you just walked in off the street and watched that scene, you wouldn't think much of it, but to people who do this for a living, the decision by a haggard and probably homeless streetwalker to pay a fine for a bad arrest comes down to an elaborate series of mathematical calculations, most of which the public has no conception of. In a vacuum, that prostitute's case probably would have been tossed out. There was something wrong with the arrest, and if it were somehow to go all the way to trial, the state would probably lose, a fact seemingly recognized by all sides in their brief 10-second deliberation. But the state doesn't have to win at trial. A truth captured in another common expression in this courtroom is, quote, "the punishment is the process," end quote. The state could charge a misdemeanor anyway and demand high bail and almost certainly get it. After her arrest, the 54-year-old woman had been interviewed at the precinct house by a probably bored and sleep-deprived bureaucrat from the nonprofit criminal justice agency who asked her questions about her address, criminal history, whether she would have family coming to the courtroom this morning, she would not, and whether she'd ever missed a court appearance. The answers were all bad ones. Tons of convictions, tons of arrests, a history of missed appearances. It all added up to one thing. If the state asks for bail, she's not getting it. Bail. In criminal cases, big and small, it's the whole thing. Everything comes down to bail. Lawyers in this courthouse have yet another saying, quote, "If you go in, you stay in. If you get out, you stay out," end quote. If you get arrested for a B misdemeanor in New York City, let's say it's prostitution, you might face a punishment of 15 to 90 days. But if you don't make bail, you'll almost automatically spend at least that long in jail waiting for trial. The state knows this. So essentially, charging a person who can't make bail with B misdemeanor is the same as convicting that person. You file the charge, the judge sets a high bail, you go back inside, and then you eventually plead to time served because, well, why not? You've already done the time. The only difference is you've got a conviction now, which means the next time you get arrested, the denial of bail, or punishingly high bail, will be even more automatic. Additionally, every misdemeanor conviction in New York carries a $200 surcharge, plus you have to have a DNA sample taken if it's your first. And that's true for a violation of every single penal law in New York State, excepting traffic violations. So your DNA is on file forever, and giving the sample costs $50, a testing procedure that, of course, you pay yourself. So that's kind of the idea I wanted to get through on the how it works in terms of bail. What they do is they want to, if they just want to hold you, they'll just set a bail that they know is too high for the person, which is always a poor person, likely of color, to pay, and then you end up in waiting for God knows how many months until you actually, the time comes for you to go to trial, and then what you do is you end up pleading out for time served, but you have to take the conviction to plead your way out. And of course, they know that you know as a poor person that to fight it, to actually take it to trial is, costly, time-consuming, time away from a job possibly that you really need to put food on the table, and certainly something that you really can't handle as a poor person. So they just go, okay, well, we're going to give you time served, which is just the time you spent in there while you in the can while you couldn't pay bail. And almost everybody takes that deal. But it's bogus because they have it really incentivized for poor people to just stay out of the criminal justice process, even if they're innocent, because it's just too time-consuming and costly to fight some of these things. And that's the rub. That's exactly what they want to do, and that's how broken Windows policing works, and that's how our criminal justice system works against the poor, and particularly people of color. So I'm going to read to you here, lastly, something that kind of sums up all of this stuff. They're talking about at the end of the chapter whether or not you can simply be given a summons or even arrested for not obeying an order a policeman gives you, even if it's something like move out of the way. Like you're on the sidewalk and they tell you to move, and if you don't move, can you be, in fact, arrested for doing so? There are two important concepts here that work hand in hand. One, there's the idea that failure to follow a police officer, no matter how stupid or unreasonable, is cause for an arrest or a summons. The second idea is that the prosecutor can essentially turn any misdemeanor case against most anyone into a de facto conviction, simply by filing charges and following through long enough with pretrial pressure to wrest a plea out of the accused. And they mention this a lot in this chapter as well. They will, at every impasse, try to get everybody that's in this system, all the poor people, to basically take a plea, and they'll keep reducing what you have to pay if it's a fine or your jail time all the way to the end, just to keep you from fighting it, especially if they know that you'll win if you take it to trial. So a lot of people, they end up getting forced even further and further incentivized by even their own lawyer or the judge, by them saying, okay, you can either take this to trial and waste a whole bunch of your time, or we'll just give you a $25 fine for the loitering or whatever it was that they brought you in for that was bogus in the first place. And a lot of people look at that and they go, $25 and I can be done with this right now. I take the conviction, the plea bargain, I pay $25 and I'm out today. They just take that rather than coming back 10 times or 50 times over the next year to actually fight it in court, and they don't know if they're going to win. The court designs it this way on purpose, and it's a good way for them to also make money. As you notice there, they get money for that DNA test they were talking about. But let's keep going. These two concepts operating together have resulted in a new policing method, one that relies upon thousands of arrests for trivial offenses, real and imagined. Police spill out into neighborhoods and troll for arrestable subjects using methods that, again, are closer to commercial fishing than old-school surveillance and investigative policing. There is even a roving factory boat you bring to your catch, i.e. the van cruising through the neighborhood that we talked about in episode previous to this on Chapter 2. You round up people, search them. If they don't bend exactly into the shape you order them to bend to, you pull them in and slap them with a summons. This is going on all over the country. In Baltimore, a former police officer named Peter Moskos wrote a book called Cop in the Hood that described how police routinely would order people to move off of a spot, exactly what Andrew goes through once a month or so, and then arrest them if they're too slow or give an attitude for any reason at all. They search people, look for drugs or guns, and then throw them back in the ocean, but not before arresting them for loitering. In one typical year, in 2005, more than 22,000 people in NYC were arrested for loitering. The vast majority of those arrests were dismissed, but the original crime in nearly all those cases, refusing to obey an order to move, was and is a legal absurdity, creating what one city councilman called an epidemic of false arrest. So that's it in a nutshell, and I was going to read to you a little bit further, but for the sake of not going over too much, I think you guys have gotten the idea. Basically, this is a system that is rigged in every single way, from the way that they catch poor people, to the way they treat them in the justice system, to the way that they set your bail, to the way that your lawyer talks to you, to the way that the judge treats you, is completely rigged against the poor. And then he goes on to draw a contrast with the last 5 or so pages, talking about how AIG, the bank that basically stole like $600 million from its shareholders and was one of those, like, you know, responsible for tanking our economy, that none of the board of directors ever saw a day in jail or prison, even though a lot of them pleaded guilty to a lot of that stuff. And it's crazy because via a series of technicalities over the next couple of months and years after AIG went down, all of them got off. None of them ever saw a day in jail. And that's the point. White collar crime is bulletproof in this country. You can't prosecute it. It's very difficult. We talked about that in the first chapter. And this is the contrast, guys. They do they rig the system in favor of the rich and against the poor on purpose. And it's not just for money, it's also because they want these police officers, it's set into their system to get as many people arrested and into the system as possible, because the more arrests you make, the more likely you are to, climb the ladder at the police force. They like seeing that you're actually, out there doing broken windows policing, and you're racking up the arrests and the summonses. But police don't want to do any real work most of the time. They want to do this stuff, which is easy and safe, and it racks their numbers up. So it's built into our policing system as well, that a lot of the people that do a lot of this shit, they end up with racking up the arrests and therefore get promoted at work. So it's also, the policing system is completely backwards. And again, guys, it's against these people's Fourth Amendment rights. You can't search somebody without probable cause, and you can't just make up probable cause. And that's what they're doing. They're doing what they do in Minority Report, pre-crime. They're assuming that where there's one broken window, there's an inevitability of other broken windows, so you must check everyone's pockets for rocks. Can't do it. It's against the Constitution. But this is rampant in our country right now. So that's basically the entire chapter. It was a very long chapter, and I hope I've gone over it without belaboring it too much and without missing anything. The book is great so far. I'll do chapter 4 soon. Again, it's a very long chapter, over 50 pages, I think. So in the next week, I'll get to chapter 4 with you. But now I think you're starting to understand, guys, the way that the system fundamentally, the criminal justice system I'm talking about, is fundamentally rigged against the poor, which necessarily means it's fundamentally rigged against people of color. Conversely, it's rigged for the rich, which means it is, in fact, rich. It's mostly rich white people that are, let off the hook when they crash our economy and when they commit financial fraud and embezzlement and all these financial crimes across the board. They never see a moment in jail. So that's wrong, and I imagine he's going to elaborate on more stuff that goes on beyond this. We're not even half done with the book right now. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I highly encourage you guys to look up Broken Windows Policing if you're not familiar with it. If you haven't gotten enough out of this video, it wouldn't take you long to kind of brush up on it, because it's an easy thing to understand once it's been broken down. They catch you with bogus charges, or you fit the description, or you're in the hood walking around at night. They fabricate probable cause, and that's how they get you with a summons or an arrest if you have a prior or a little bit of dope on you or a weapon. And then once you're in the system, they use the cash bail system to keep you incarcerated against your rights, even though you haven't actually been convicted of anything, only to let you out on time served, and that is a prior manufacturing mechanism. It incentivizes people to take convictions that they necessarily don't have to, that they could fight and probably beat, because it's easier, because fighting it is so difficult and costly that you can't possibly do it as a poor person. And then they force you to take a plea bargain, which is, again, the second part of the prior manufacturing mechanism that Taibbi goes over in here. Once you understand that conceptually, you kind of got it. And that's what I've taken from this chapter. Anyway, keep fighting the good fight out there. I'll get chapter 4 to you by sometime next week.